Where do we go next? And this is all based on, so Raymond Moody, you all know who he is, has spoken at my conference many times. And I was having a conversation with him once, and we were saying, aren't you tired of hearing NDE stories? How many have you heard? How many do we have in the record? 10,000? At least 20,000? And we hear them over and over, and they're all different. And what mostly we hear through IANDs is American white person NDEs. So where do we need to go next? Besides hearing the same stories over and over again, obviously we have to go to multicultural. But this was the conversation that I had with Raymond. What are we going to do now? We can't just sit and keep compiling these stories forever. We have to take some kind of action. So that's the topic of this talk. Any comments before I'm good? And now,
we need to find the action.
Yes, we need to find the action, and that's what we're going to do. Now, I don't normally use slides, but I wanted to with this, so bear with me because I don't really know what I'm doing with the slideshow. So, one of the first things I realized, and with the Afterlife Conference we realized this too, is the NDEs that we've heard about in American Judeo-Christian white middle-class culture have certain elements to them that are the same and certain that are different. But we know that a Hindu is probably not going to see Jesus. A Christian is probably not going to see the pantheon of Hindu gods. There's a whole different thing. There are two guys who've written books on this. Hopefully I can jump right over to this slide, that I want you to know their names, if you know it. Mark Mirabello, ever heard of him? And Gregory Shushan. So what these two guys have done is they've done research on near-death experience in cultures other than our own. And so Mark Mirabello, A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife, is just an absolutely wonderful book. And I'll tell you some of the things that he found. I'm jumping all over. I'm not staying in sequence, but
that's okay.
But what else is new? Where are Mark Mirabello's things? So what Mark came up with in his research is he looked in all these different cultures, and the bottom line of this is that what you experience in other dimensions is culturally subjective. And we know this from Melvin Morse's research with children in Closer to the Light, where he was a pediatrician and he had all these little kids under 5 years old, who were resuscitated. And some of them would come back and say, I saw Jesus, because they were indoctrinated to Jesus. Some would say, I saw Grandma. My favorite one was a kid who said, I flew into the sun and it hugged me. That was a kid who had no dead grandmother and no Jesus in his indoctrination. So what this new research is starting to look at, put a bookmark in that, because we have the internet, we have multicultural awareness like we have never had before. That we have never had before. You can go on Google and say, you know, what do the Zulu tribes think is in the afterlife? And you'll find tons of stuff. 30 years ago, we couldn't do this. So now this is coming into our awareness, and that's the kind of research that's happening here. So some of the stuff that Mark found that I just love is I can't even say the name of this tribe, but 11th century Jain. Are you familiar with the Jain religion? They claim that a man who dies in the act of sexual intercourse will be reborn in the womb of his lover. That's beautiful. That makes total sense, right? And okay, let's look at a couple other ones. The Eskimos leave a skull of a bear they have killed face down at the place where it was slain. This, they believe, allows it to be reborn. You see a lot of this in indigenous cultures. Many African tribes believe that you can be reincarnated as an animal, but the Zulus believe that only a chief can come back as a lion. So they have all these different beliefs that are different than ours. So how does this inform their near-death experiences, which they obviously have? And so what's come out of a lot of this research is, and this can go back to anything, Why do the Zulus think a chief can come back as a lion? Anybody got a guess?
The lion is the king of the jungle?
Because somebody died and came back and saw the chief in the form of a lion. Because it happened. So it's just like laws, right? You know, the reason we have laws against things is because somebody did that thing and it caused a problem, so they made a law against it. So the reason we have depictions of heaven and the afterlife is because somebody was there and came back and told the tribe, right? Somebody was resuscitated and the Zulu guy said, hey, I went to the other world and I saw our chief and he was a lion. And they all went, oh, wow, so let's put that into our legacy. Let's build that into our cultural story. The chief will come back as a lion. It's probably happened more than once. Many people went and saw the chief as a lion. And so the stories that we have, just using biblical stories, I mean, all the stuff that we have, pearly gates and golden streets and all that stuff, somebody somewhere in the history of our culture had that experience. Went out of body, died, came back, and saw some place with pearly gates and golden streets, and had enough influence in the tribe to have that written into the record of the belief system of that tribe. That's where all of this comes from. So we right now are doing that, right? With our near-death experiences, we're writing it into the historical record of our tribe, with the things that we know that are common, light, and tunnel, and ancestors, and all the things that we know. But it's really important to know how culturally influenced these are. Yeah?
Yeah, just a clarification. So take Christ, for example. Are you saying that that's purely a subjective sort of impression that people feel because of the use of the term indoctrinated? Or do you understand Christ as some entity that may well be sustained by our collective consciousness here?
I understand Christ as an expression of consciousness, but the image of Christ that people see is something very different. So, I mean, what do we see when we see Jesus? Not we in this room, but the collective we see white Jesus.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I know a Hindu, somebody who's really devoted to Hinduism, that said that he saw Christ as a bright light.
Because he's seeing Christ consciousness, you know, and there is a Christ consciousness, absolutely. And Christ, the person, represented that for us at that time in history and is also built into the historical story. So you could see divine love or divine energy in the form of anything, you know, and Christ is a pretty popular form that everybody knows.
Also, in Michael Newton's work, he speaks of their classic Western archetypal symbols like the Greek temple, the library, so on, how people experience accessing their Akashic records.
That's, yes.
In this very conventional Earth-like form.
Earth references. Earth subjective imagery. And if you guys...
The collective.
It's in the collective, yeah. You guys, anybody know Diane Goebel? Does that name ring a bell? So she wrote a couple books. In her NDE, she drowned. And in her NDE, she was in this like vertical tube of library books. Round and round and round. And she was shooting up through this tube, absorbing everything that was in all these books. And when she came out of the top is when her head came out of the water from her drowning. And that's a very Western thing, because the Zulu guy does not have a reference of library books like that. So for him, who knows what it looks like? You know, maybe he's under the ground with the hedgehogs or whatever reference that he has. So it's just important for us to remember as we go forward in this work that these are culturally influenced. Now, is there anything that's completely objective? Light, love, feeling of healing, and all of that? My opinion is yes, that would be objective and that would echo through everybody's experience. But I can't say that, I don't know, because you also carry the stuff that you've carried from your incarnation with you, right? Yeah.
Well, that makes sense in the sense that what's most formless is the most objective.
Yes.
It's the least arbitrary.
Nice. What's most, right, so the form,
To the extent that anything that we can conceive of objectivity at all, at least in that part of the spectrum, seems less formal, less controversial.
right, so what's formless? Light, love, spaciousness, floating, a sense of non-attachment to the physical world, to the attachments and the pains that you've carried with you, yeah.
Yeah, I remember PMH Atwater talking about one person's experience where the longer they went, the more the cultural faces melded into just points of light,
Right.
and points of love.
Yes. And so this is what I say a lot. When you are flatlined and resuscitated, you go this far into the afterlife. You just step into the doorway and then whoop, you step out again. So all you're really seeing is just this first inch of something that's just endless. So we don't really know. And we do know, that we carry our stuff with us because what we know about life reviews, and also if you look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead, what they go through in their 49 days of bardo, facing their projections and their fears and their scars. So what we know is an inch of something that's infinite. Yeah.
Just the lobby.
The lobby, I call it the foyer, yeah.
Well, in some NDE reports, people do report being, at least momentarily, for a very short time, experiencing the absolute. But then there's this bounce back, as opposed to afterlife communications, which generally come from a particular level, if you want to look at it. There seem to be reports of at least a momentary experience.
And I think that depends on who we are and what we take with us. So if somebody in this room who's had a lot of experience with this kind of thing and has been studying this for a long time and has done deep meditation and out-of-body work, you're probably not going to be stuck so much in that entryway as hard as somebody who's absolutely steeped in some sort of doctrine. And so, we're sort of ahead of the game that way. And the thing about after-death communication is if we can't get an accurate picture from reports of people who've been in the afterlife for 1 minute, where are we going to get that accurate picture from? The only place that I know to get it from is mediums, really good mediums, and from our own intentional out-of-body explorations and work with after-death communications. The thing about mediums is that the vast majority of people who go to a medium do not go to the medium and say, tell me all about the deepest realms of the afterlife. What they really say is, does my husband have a message for me? And that's pretty much all they want. And so we don't have a lot of good, this is a great research project for someone who would like to do it, is to get a bunch of great mediums and just ask them about the afterlife. No messages from loved ones, forget all that. What can you really tell me about what's way, 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 way down in there?
Didn't you do that with your son?
Yeah, absolutely I did that with my son.
What did you learn?
What I learned from him, and again, I'm going to also say this is subjective to his experience and my experience, because he's talking to me in a language with images and symbols that I understand. And he showed me things like, and it's in my book, which is for sale over there. One of the first things that I remember was this garden. And there was this handsome, beautiful man in a tree picking fruit. And there was my son. And I said, who's that man? And he said, well, that's Arlen. He's been one of our guides for a really long time. And he was with us in a past life in Greece. He was one of our teachers in the Stoic movement. He told me this whole thing. And then I said to my son, you look like a little 10-year-old boy, but sometimes I look at you and you look like you're 30. And he said, I will appear to you in an expression of whatever I'm learning. So sometimes when I'm in real baby learning mode here in heaven, I will look like a little child to you. And sometimes when I'm more in teaching mode, I will look like a monk. You know, and he told me that. I mean, he told me tons and tons of things. You know, he showed me this place that he called the Healing Garden, and he just gave me this whole story of there's a man sitting on a bench, and he is sitting there with this man, and he's telling me this man on earth is in a hospital bed right now, really, really sick and dying, and he's not sure if he wants to stay or go. And so I'm here, and I can talk to his soul here in this healing garden and helping the man to decide if he wants to heal, if he wants to die, whatever he wants to do. And then the man goes back, wakes up out of his coma or not, or whatever. And so that kind of healing goes on with healers and guides. So he told me tons of stuff like that. Now, if we were Zulus, he might have shown me something completely different.
In what form do you hear him?
Well, it's changed. It's changed over time. It's not like it was. And this is something that used to really bother me, because in the beginning, I could talk to him just like I'm talking to you right now. I mean, he would be sitting in the seat in the car next to me when I was driving. It was just,
You just felt him.
I just felt him. But he would tell me things. He would like unfurl scrolls of information to where I'd have to pull over the car. I used to keep a tape recorder with me because it would just come so fast. And that's the content of my first 2 books.
Picked up his voice on tape?
Oh no, that was my voice recording what he was saying to me, because it was coming so fast I couldn't write it down. And so after about, and I just would feel him everywhere. You know, when I was a hospice volunteer, I'd see him bouncing around the bedsides of all the patients, you know, just kind of like Tigger, you know, just like, hi, hey. About the 3rd or 4th year, it started to fade away. And I got really sad because I thought, oh, I'm losing him all over again. And that was right around the time when I started going to school. So I went into total left brain intellectual life and closed down the right brain, because now I'm looking at data and writing papers and using that part of my brain. And I would say like, oh no, you know, come back. And so I talked to some of my medium friends, and they said, all relationships change. Why should it be any different across dimensions? He's maturing and growing up, going on to whatever he's going to be. I'm changing. How many of you have been married for a long time? Is it the same relationship it was the first year? That's what the mediums told me. Here's another thing they told me. People ask me this all the time. Would I know if he was incarnated somewhere on Earth? And so I asked him, and he said, if both people are out of body, or disembodied, okay? I'm in heaven, you're in heaven. And I'm just gonna call it heaven because it's easier. Then we don't have these dense bodies and the egos and all the baggage and all the stuff to block the communication. So if 2 people are dead, they have a pretty clear conduit. If one person is physical and the other person isn't, in this case me, the physical person, I'm just under this big dense bag of meat, and I've got all my thoughts and crap and fear in the way, and I can't, well, in this case, both of us are physical if he's incarnated, so we can't connect as well because we're both in the illusion of the 3-dimensional world, you know?
There's another thing that I've been learning recently about having a body. It gives an illusion of kind of simplicity or unity that makes it harder to understand the sort of inner community that we are. We have, you know, the inner critic and the inner child and all that. You can break it down psychologically. And as you say, with your son who can manifest in different stages of his development and his path and so on, you look at someone in a body and there's just like this one thing.
It's one thing.
It's this illusion of unity.
Yeah.
And it's not real unity on this level either.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and, you know, this brings up so many questions of like, you know, why do we have bodies?
Yeah.
You know, how many of you have read the Tibetan Book of the Dead? It's really good stuff. You know, it explained birth and death so perfectly to me when I read it when I was young. And, you know, basically what happens is you die, and the priest sits next to the body, and for 49 days he reads this book to you, and he guides your soul through their vision of the afterlife, which goes beyond just the doorway, 49 days, I don't know why. And it's like, okay, so here you are, now you're walking in the realm of the yellow light. Don't go there, turn left, look over there to the white light. That's what it says, and go over there. And now you're walking along and, oh look, here come some demons and they're tearing off your legs and they're gonna eat you and devour you. Pay no attention to those demons. They're just projections of your own fears and your own stuff. And so they guide you to keep going past all those things that pull you down until the very end. The very last thing you see is you start to be attracted to the things of the earth. The wind, the beautiful grass, the beach, all the things of earth you get these visions and they start to pull you. And the biggest, strongest vision of all that pulls you the most, anybody know what it is?
Chocolate.
Sex. Not chocolate.
It's what?
Sex. This is what it says. You start to see visions of people having sex. Two particular people, a male and female. And you go, ooh, that looks like fun. That's really drawing me. And you jump in. And that's how you get conceived. Isn't that amazing?
That happens after the birth.
Yes, that's the end.
At the end of the
That's the end. Yeah, that's how you come in. Now, you don't have to.
That's a bit weird because sometimes pregnancies happen when there's force involved and
Right, but someone who's born from that pregnancy is there for a reason, right? And this is where we get this very pop idea now of how we pick our parents.
Yeah.
And so the rape is also us picking our parents and picking the life that we're going to have as a child born from rape or whatever it is. And this is a very hard thing for people to wrap their heads around. So another thing that I learned from my communications with my son was, I said, okay, so you were this kid with this terrible disease and you were severely disabled and, why didn't you come to Earth as a perfect human being? Why all this misery? And he said, well, it's like this. It's like you're sitting around in the interlife, which is Michael, why am I blanking on his name? Newton, thank you. Michael Newton's term. It's not an afterlife, it's an interlife, the life between lives. And in the interlife, you're sitting there around this big conference table with all your friends, and you're kind of planning what you're going to do next. And so I'm sitting there at the conference table saying, well, I think I'd really like to be a religious scholar and a spiritual teacher. And here's this other little soul going, oh, okay, I can help you with that. I'll come in and I'll be your kid with this disease and you'll learn about caregiving and death and you'll be a hospice and blah, blah, blah. And we make the plan and we pop in to incarnation. Now, we don't remember making this plan. And I could never say this to a group of grieving parents because they would kill me.
Yes.
But I can say it to you because...
What are your thoughts about, what are your thoughts about, like there's certain people I do not want to come back with?
Those are the ones you're probably going to come back with. Because those are the teachers, the people who've hurt you the most. If your intention is to grow, that's who you pick. You pick a disabled body. Do you guys remember the boy in the bubble?
Yep.
So in 1974, before I was into any of this stuff, I was 21 and I was watching TV and I saw a news report about this. And does anybody not know what that is? Everybody knows. And so here was this kid who lived in this bubble because he had this immune thing. And I remember thinking, I did know about souls, I guess, then. And I said, why would a soul pick that body? And I immediately knew that it was because that soul said, I'm going to be born this time with no ego at all. No attachments, no sexuality, no, intellectual pursuits or whatever. I'm going to just pick the weirdest body that I can have so I can get over all the body stuff real fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of this is really new to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely coming reformed with all of this conceptual stuff. But when you speak about this to people who may have physical challenges, or other people who have had, the NDE, and they hear you say things like, that your story, it's really kind of a subjective thing. And it may not be this absolute truth. How do people generally react? I would think that, some people would get really
Some people do.
upset.
I get hate mail once in a while, mostly from rabbis. Seriously.
What you're saying.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can see somebody who was born, I have, some of the people who I'm closest to have been born with really severe disabilities. And I don't think a single one of them would say, yeah, this is a life I chose.
No, they wouldn't, but some of them would. I also know lots of people with severe disabilities who do say that because they've been on a spiritual path and they've looked at it this way. So, I'm very careful what audiences I say which things to, of course. But like, I will say sometimes that, let's say there's a terrible accident. A car sideswipes you, you're paralyzed. In that moment, and it's literally an intersection of experience, there's you, there's the driver, there's the witnesses, the bystanders, the paramedics, the doctors in the hospital, your family, the driver's family, this huge circle of people that are completely changed because of this one little thing that happened. And that circle just expands out forever and ever. In my way of thinking, and I'm not saying this is the absolute truth, but this makes sense to me, is there's a purpose for that. Because every single one of those people shifted and changed and contributed something different to society, or maybe not. Maybe they became drug addicts or killed themselves or whatever. It all goes into the soup. And if you realize that we're all just part of this soup, and it's not just about your little, here's another way to explain it. This is something my son also told me. He said it's like a kaleidoscope. So in a kaleidoscope, it looks like every piece is separate, but they're actually in a container. And everything that happens, that car crash that paralyzes you, is a little turn on the kaleidoscope. All the pieces break apart and come back together a different way. Every single thing that happens in time-space does that. A bee fertilizes a flower, you spit on the sidewalk, whatever, everything, because everything is connected within that container, and the kaleidoscope just keeps moving. And your little piece of the kaleidoscope is in there with everything else. You're not out here by yourself. And that's why I can say that. And I would never say it's the absolute truth. This is just what I have learned.
Since you had a direct communication with your son, did he guide you into any specifics around specific circumstances in your life and point to the kaleidoscope and the relevance of the kaleidoscope in relationship to actual details of things occurring in your life?
Nope.
Since you had a tipster.
Nope, he never ever would do that. And everything I've learned from channeling, from channelers, is that the guides, and my son in that sense is just another guide, they don't tell you anything specific. They don't say, yes, take that job, move to Seattle, marry that guy. They never ever do
Not
that.
about which direction to go, but more insights around the unfolding of things that have already occurred.
Yes, I get a lot of that, but it doesn't happen before. It usually happens after. Well, so just as an example, I have been in school for 10 years because I never went to college when I was young. I started at 56 with my bachelor's degree, and now I'm just about to get a doctorate and be finished. The last 10 years of my life, which is the same 10 years that I've been channeling my son. So, well, that's actually been 12 years. But he's basically sent me to school. But he didn't say, go to this school, take this class. It wasn't like that. I just felt inspired to do that in a field that was related to death and grief. And do I feel like he's behind that? Of course. He to me, he's like the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. Yeah.
So Terri, I'll give you a scenario. If you are with a muggle type person and they have cancer and they're dealing with that, you can't tell them,
No.
gee, why don't you look at why you brought that on as a learning experience?
No.
No.
Fucking kill you.
No, you don't do that.
So,
You'd never do that.
yeah.
There's no question. It's just not even a question. You just don't do that.
All right, go take chemo then, I guess.
Well, see, now you're talking about what chaplaincy, and also grief counseling and trauma counseling. Like one of the first things that you do in trauma counseling is you don't ask somebody to talk about their trauma.
Yeah.
The first thing you do is make them feel safe. And the second thing you do is get them to be relaxed in their body, and then the talking about the story comes much later. In chaplaincy, I was a hospital chaplain for 3 years, and I sat in conversations like that all the time. We're trained to just listen, which is why I didn't want to be a chaplain, because I would rather talk.
Question?
Yep.
I was wondering, was there something that, I imagine our minds are so incredible, and I've had a lot of transcendental experiences, I'm sure everybody in this room, but was there something where it took you out of wondering whether you're projecting for your grief, even though you probably knew in your heart you weren't? Was there one or two things where you knew this is real?
Real channeling?
Yeah.
I almost always knew, because it feels different.
In what way?
Well, I know what it feels like to talk to myself. Something happens. I mean, you almost get, I don't want to say possessed, but it's different. It's not yourself. I don't know how to explain it. It doesn't feel like you.
Could you try? Only because I've had these experiences myself, so you're so sure. And I've had mind experiences that also felt different sensations, and so.
Well, here's an interesting thing. So somebody would say, well, how do you know that's not your imagination? And then what I would always say is, well, what is imagination? You use your imagination to make a painting. Mm-hmm. But I also think that images for art also come from heaven, from a collective. So maybe imagination is a very limiting word. So yeah, it's your imagination. It's coming through a conduit of some kind. So if you're sitting there receiving messages and having visions and whatever, why not believe it? Yeah. Why not? Now, if you're hearing voices that say, go get a gun and shoot the little kids at the school, why is that different? And that's creepy and scary to even think about. So I would say to you, believe all your visions and trust it, but if your vision was to shoot some kids at a school, I wouldn't say that. I don't know what I would say, because I don't even know what that is. I can't even touch that. That's like so beyond anything I can think about. Yeah.
I'm asking this question from having had two experiences. One was of meeting and shaking the hand of a man who I later found out had been dead for 2 years. Ooh. And I've also heard stories of materializations. Mm-hmm. This is before I'd heard any of those stories. I've also had that experience of, it's actually my late partner who passed in 2007, of standing next to me. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't see her physically, but she was there. There was no question about it. And without going into a lot of details, have you looked into these sort of degrees of being able to project and manifest physically for whatever reason? And do you believe they're important in terms of our understanding? Or
I think they're important for some people. You know, like we were talking about before, about the soul phone. Mm-hmm. You know, personally, I never felt the need for that, because I could feel it so strongly energetically that I never felt like, boy, I wish I could see a materialization. I think for me personally, it wasn't necessary because I completely trusted the process without that. But I think some people need to have that, and will get that because that's what they need to have. But manifestations happen in different ways. As you know, it's like you'll hear your favorite song on the radio, or you'll see the person's favorite bird. You know, you've heard a million stories like that. Those manifestations happen.
Also, you were speaking of a traffic accident. I've heard, and I'm sure that many of us who've come to the presentations here have heard stories of an accident occurs and a mysterious individual shows up, mm-hmm. a nurse or a helper or someone, and actually makes a difference in the situation, and then they're untraceable.
And they're untraceable, yeah.
And I'm particularly fascinated with those, because I can't imagine what it takes for whoever that presence is to materialize, just to do this.
Or maybe they're not materialized. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe they're not in physical form.
Well, in some cases, they apparently...
Sometimes they are, like they do CPR or something. Yep.
People from the car, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, I think we certainly have the capability to do that. I don't think we're evolved enough to understand how that works, but we're hopefully getting there, you know? Yep.
I want to go back to what you were saying a moment ago about, well, what if you heard a voice saying, go shoot somebody at the school or something? And I think a part of this that is important to address is that while many people go into the light and they continue their evolutionary process,
Right.
some people get stuck. And they don't know that they're dead, or they die with great angst and continue that, and also can influence people who are alive. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that phenomenon also.
You know, that's a really interesting question that we kick around at the Afterlife Conference all the time, because half of us believe that people get stuck and half of us don't. And I'm in the don't camp.
Oh, okay.
And that's because, and again, everything I'm saying is just my own experience and my own opinion. And I argue this with shamans and mediums all the time.
What do we mean by stuck?
Well, that's a good question. So what some people, like, you've heard of rescue mediums? Okay, and some of the shamans do this where you'll say, like, my loved one committed suicide, or no, he died, we never found his body, everything is unresolved, or he was depressed or whatever, and I think he's not really progressing in the afterlife. Okay. Can you go find him and bring him to the light? Now, there are so many things wrong with that conversation. The first one is, I think he's not progressing in the afterlife. Really? Who are you to have such an opinion? What do you know? Well, I have these dreams about him, and he's screaming and crying, and he's lost, and okay, so that's, you know, the second part of is the medium saying, all right, I'm going to go in there and find him, and I'm going to take him to where he's supposed to be. How do you know where he's supposed to be? Maybe he is where he's supposed to be. Because the problem is we are so stuck in this sense of linear time. Okay, he's been dead for 3 years. He should be fully in the light by now. But I think that he's screaming and hiding behind a rock. And that's because you're the one who's screaming and hiding behind the rock. Because the journey of each soul at that level is none of our business. It is so totally none of our business. And so I happen to be of the school of thought of wherever they are is where they're supposed to be. And they're working on it in their own way, according to their own plan, with their own helpers. So is a stuck person hiding behind the rock the one giving the message to the guy to go shoot the kids? I don't know. I mean, I say I don't know to some questions because I just don't know. You know, but I've done processes in shamanism where you go and you look for lost people. I've done that, you know, because, you know, in the school of shamanism that I did is there's a plant world and an animal world and a stone world, and we did processes where I went and looked for somebody's grandmother, and I saw her in the plant world hiding behind the plants, and I said, oh, come on out, and she was like, oh, okay, and that was the whole thing. And it was like, well, did I really have to do that? Maybe she was okay there, you know? And so I feel weird about that. But, you know, if some of my shaman teachers were here, they would tell it completely differently. So speaking of shamanism, I would just move on to a couple of quick things. So a lot of the study that I've done is on comparative religion, and so I put a couple of these slides in just for fun, because we have this notion called sky gods. So we, you know, why do we think heaven's in the sky? Why do we think God is in the sky? Because as early primitive people, life came from the sky. Rain, sun, thunder. We're laying around our campsite and looking up at, and we see these stars. We don't know what this is. So the sky is the source of everything. So we started to create these mythologies about gods who came from the sky. So this is an African one. These are some Norse, oh wait, how do I do this? Norse sky gods, you've heard of these guys. I'm just showing you a few of these. They do have six packs. Yeah, but they're very powerful, like they're thunder gods. They make life and death happen, and we place them in the sky. And what that looks like now is that. So that's God in the sky, controlling everything. And of course, then we have Santa Claus, who is the ultimate sky god, who comes down the chimney, which is a conduit from the sky to the earth. But then again, when we start to look at history and all these stories of out-of-body journeys that everybody's had, it's all through the Bible, it's all through history, all the saints and the sages in every tradition, there are these stories, and when they're describing floating out of their body, they're floating up, they're in this vast open space of light, it all looks like, kind of like the sky. And so people have been telling these stories forever. Do you guys know the Saved by the Bell story? Does everybody know that?
Saved by the Bell?
Bell. You ever heard the expression Saved by the Bell?
Yeah.
So what the way it originated, as the legend goes, I don't know if this is true, is back in the old days before they had stethoscopes, they couldn't really tell if a person was dead right away. And there are ways to tell. Like when somebody's dead, their blood stops flowing, and if you turn them over and look at their back is red. Because if they're laying down, their blood just sinks down by gravity. So there are ways to tell. But in the old days, they used to bury people alive a lot. And so they would tie a little string, if they weren't sure, they would tie a little string around their finger through the coffin up to a little bell hanging on a pole. And if the person woke up, they would ring it and all the village would come. Now, I don't know if this is true. Has anyone else ever heard this story?
It's true.
Is it true?
I thought it came from boxing.
It came from boxing?
Where the bell rings and the round is over and...
I think it's boxing, yeah.
Well, but I think it was way before boxing.
I've heard the same story that you just told.
Yeah, and so what that tells us that people died and woke up again a lot. It happened enough that they came up with a system to identify it. So it's not that unusual, and that's why we have it, that's just been forever. So here's, let's see, what did I say here? So the Abrahamic trilogy is Jewish, Christian, Islam. These three religions are not very different from each other. They're all rooted in Judaism, in the first earliest Hebrew stories, which then moved into Christianity, which then moved into Islam. And they're full of channeling and OBEs. And just as example, I could quote Bible stuff forever, but I'm not going to do that. But all this stuff happened to everybody. And what happened as these religions started to get organized is, in order to control people and put them into nice little groups and make them do what you want, you have to make laws against things that make people free. And if you're not afraid of death, that's the ultimate freedom. So if you're having these experiences, you're going to have a culture of people that's not afraid of death. Well, we can't have that. Because we have to have some way to control you, so we have to tell you that death is bad and that you're going to be punished. So we start making up these doctrines and these stories about hell and punishment and all that. And that's all I wanted to say about religion. I could talk about this forever, but...
Good summary.
Thank you. 10 years of theology school, so I could say that. Okay, so here's what I really wanted to talk about tonight. I am jumping all over the place. This is kind of fun. So I took a class, an undergrad class called The Psychology of Religion. Really fun class. And we had this big textbook. And in this textbook, there's a section on near-death experience, and lo and behold, it talks all about Raymond Moody. So I say to my teacher, I know that guy. And the teacher goes, you do not. I'm like, yeah, I do. And I can get him to come and do a Skype into our class. And the teacher goes, wow, really? So we did that. And we had Raymond come into the class, and I got an A, of course.
That's the whole reason why you did that.
But one of the things that was so interesting in this class that I learned is, okay, we're going to talk about Sam Parnia's research a little bit later, but you guys know who Sam Parnia is? Okay, well, we'll get to him. But the largest NDE study that's ever been done, and the most definitive, was Parnia's. And among other things that he concluded is that only about 2% of people who go out of their body and have some sort of remembered experience actually remember it. And that's because resuscitation is such a terrible thing to do to a body that you get brain damage every time they do it. Because your brain dies a little bit, the clinical definition of death is not your heart stopping, it's end of brain activity. So when your brain activity is gone, you're dead, and the brain just dies, just like when you have a stroke. A little bit of your brain dies. So they bring you back and they bring you back, and you have less of a brain. And the part of the brain that tends to die when they do that is, according to Parnia, the part that holds memories. So that's why so many people who come back from resuscitation do not have any memory of where they were. 2% is what he found. The other part of this is that people will not tell the clinicians that they have this experience, because why?
Nuts.
Because they'll go right to a psych evaluation. And so I thought that that was so important, talking about how we go forward and we teach this in the world. This is really important stuff. We have to find a way to make it okay for people to wake up from that resuscitation and tell their story without being sedated. So I did this little research paper. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a big book, and it has for therapists and doctors to use how to diagnose everything. Every symptom, you can lay a diagnosis on it so that you can give them medication and get paid from the insurance. I did this little comparison about things that happen in NDEs and how it corresponds with diagnosis in the DSM. It's fascinating. So here's something that happens in NDE. The DSM calls this depersonalization disorder, a sense of split self with one part observing and another participating. So you tell your doctor at the hospital that you were out of your body, he goes to the DSM and he looks and he finds that. Next one, enhanced cognitive, can you read this? Okay, so these are things we experience when we're out of body. And of course this corresponds with delusions of grandiosity, because the experience speaks of an important discovery of great insight.
Oh my goodness, insight is such a terrible thing.
It's insane, you're crazy if you have insight. So this is why people don't know this, but the doctors know this. Okay, here's another one. This is exactly what happens in your NDEs, and this is how it's diagnosed in the DSM. Clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers, and do not derive from ordinary life experience. So that means that your peer in your same culture does not understand what all this stuff is, and therefore it puts you in the category of mentally deranged. Encountering a non-ordinary realm inhabited by post-mortem others, that means your dead friends, relatives, friends, animals, and beings, and like visual hallucinations. And this is fine, the last one, telepathic communications with other beings, auditory, So I should be in the loony bin, locked up in deep freeze, and all of us, most of us. And here's the little caveat, is that you still function like a normal person. Your functioning's not impaired, your behavior's not bizarre, your hallucinations don't interrupt your life or cause you to do crazy things. And it's not attributable to a physiological condition like brain damage. So that's what we're dealing with in the medical establishment. Wow. Yeah, I thought you guys would like that. Okay, so now I want to talk about, and feel free.
They would diagnose that as schizoid, or?
Well, it could be schizoid affective disorder. There's a bunch of them, okay. But these are called the diagnostic criteria, right. And so it depends. They could be looking at major depression. It depends what they're looking for. So in each section, you would see these, and if you have, depending what it is, 3 or more of the criteria, then they can diagnose you. And they will send you, I've worked in a hospital, I've seen this happen, they will send you for a psych evaluation. One of the things that happened to me when I was a chaplain and I was on call in the ER, some young people brought their friend in from partying out there at night, and he was this young man about 30, and his friends said, there's something wrong with him. He just all of a sudden started talking about that Jesus was with him and Jesus was talking to him. He wasn't on any drugs. We did a talk screen, no drugs. Just out of the blue with his friends. do you guys see Jesus? He's right here. How come you don't see him? Jesus, what? What are you saying? You're talking to me? And he just totally went into this thing. So he came into the ER, and I was the chaplain, and I completely believed him. And I loved this kid, and he was saying these brilliant things, and it was, and I just fell in love with him. I was like sitting at his feet. And so then it came time for the doctors to come and examine him, and he said to me, will you stay in the room with me? He wouldn't let me leave because he could feel that I supported him. Of course they sent him to the psych ward, you know, and I don't know what happened to him after that. But when I did my chaplaincy training, we would have to go on Sundays to the psych department and do Sunday morning religious services for them. That was my favorite thing to do because they were so out there and they got it, you know. And so I would, and most of the chaplains would do like regular Christian services. I would come in there and I would do guided meditations and I would do all this kind of stuff, and they loved it because they were already there. So they felt so supported and so comfortable. Anyway,
What did your medical colleagues think of you?
Well, they gave me the certification to be a chaplain, so I guess they thought I was. You know, it's funny. In my group, I had an Episcopal priest, a couple of Lutheran ministers. I can't remember the other people. They knew I was different. And my education, I did my bachelor's in a Catholic college, my master's in a Jesuit college, and my doctorate now at a Presbyterian seminary. And the only reason I'm there is because the particular kinds of degrees and training I'm looking for, that's where you get them. I mean, you could go to Harvard Divinity and get that too, but around here where I live, where I wanted to be, that's what I had to do. So I've been around those people for years. And my professors say things like when they write an evaluation, it was wonderful having Terri in the class. Her perspective is very refreshing.
What I think is sometimes people just don't really want to come to terms with is people who then are very religious and read the Bible and they believe in the stories of the Bible. And I just, as a mental health professional, I look at some of the stories and I say, you know what? The only difference between a prophet and somebody with schizophrenia is the fear.
The environment and the cultural context.
Yeah. Every single person that is in the Bible that has been called a prophet would have been in the psychiatric.
That is absolutely true. And if you look at the DSM, and you look at the diagnostic criteria for, I don't know what, schizoid affective disorder or something, it has things like they don't dress appropriately for the weather. They'll walk around barefoot in the snow. St. Francis was famous for doing that. They talk to imaginary people. They socially isolate from their families. They'll leave their families and communities and go off in isolation. Well, all the saints and the sages did that. I mean, it's really interesting to read some of those diagnostic criteria and think of all the biblical and spiritual heroes that you know, many of whom had NDEs, like Julian of Norwich was this mystic woman who lived in a 10 by 10 cell for her entire life and just did nothing but leave her body and have visions. Teresa of Avila. These, I mean, if you study these early Christian mystics, the desert mothers and the desert fathers, that's all they did. And these are the people that the Christian faith is supposed to worship and look to, but being a Christian and the organized church are two completely different things. Yeah.
Terri, do you guys have breakout sessions on Swedenborg or any of that?
We haven't at the conference had one on Swedenborg, but we would.
You know all about him?
I don't know all about him, but I know about him. Yeah, and I would love to have a session on him. Yeah.
A question, okay, near-death experience. I've had panic attacks that almost feel like near-death experiences because I feel outside. And I didn't know if you had any comments on research on that, because you were talking about disassociation. Like, I've definitely felt that, and I think a lot of it has to do with fear of the construct that I've grown up in. Christian construct, which I believe a lot of the teaching, but then some of it I feel has been, I don't know, I'm just working through that, but I don't know if I make sense.
Did you grow up Catholic?
No.
Christian?
No.
So one of the things that you're taught in we'll call it institutional Christianity, is that, and this is mostly Catholic, is that you're not supposed to explore those realms by yourself. You let the Bible do it for you, you let the priest do it for you, you do not, meditation is bad because you're not supposed to go there. That's a scary place where you have no control, and we're scared of that. So a lot of that is fear. So when you're having a panic attack, you are sort of dissociating. And what you learn in trauma counseling is what I would do with you with your panic attack is, I was just telling you this earlier, like the theory of trauma healing now is that trauma is not emotional, it's 100% physiological because it's stuck in your body. And so the way you work with trauma now is completely starting with body work. And so the first thing you do is you get yourself to relax. So this is just something I recently learned. So I would say to you right now, are you 100% safe right now? What would you say?
I would say, in my heart of hearts, yes. But I think because of things going on in my life, I feel very out of control of certain circumstances.
Are you 100% safe right now?
Never.
Interesting. Okay. See, this was hard for me to learn too.
Yeah.
And the answer to it is, if you don't use shoulds or coulds, like, well, I'm 100% right now, but there could be an earthquake, or the ceiling could cave in. And so I would keep saying, are you 100% safe right now? And when I mean right now, I mean in the second that just passed. And so what that process does is it shows you that there is a space, fleeting though it may be, where you're 100% safe. And a traumatized person isn't aware that such a space exists because they feel never safe.
But aren't you saying, and saying that, isn't that saying, were you 100% safe 1 second ago?
Yeah, but now another second has gone by. Because that's the present, that's what present time is like. Are you 100% safe right now? Yes. Are you 100% safe right now? Yes. 1 second at a time. You experience 1 second at a time of being 100% safe, you start to learn what it feels like to feel safe. And that's what panic attacks are, is you don't know that space of safety, so we try to teach that to you. How much time do I have, Rich?
We're scheduled to go to 9:30.
Okay. Okay, so now I want to talk about research. You know those guys, Melvin Morse and Raymond Moody. So this is what they look like now. They started out a lot younger. And Raymond Moody wrote a book, Life After Life. Melvin Morse, the pediatrician, closer to... Does anybody not know who these guys are? Or do you all know? Okay. So they started something absolutely amazing. Because of them, we are here today. And their research was absolutely mind-blowing and phenomenal. Their books became mainstream popular bestsellers. Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experience. He made that up. That was 40-something years ago. For various reasons, both of those men stopped doing that research a long time ago, and didn't really stay in the game and stay current and keep adding new stuff. Sometimes that happens when you have a best-selling book. And so what I want to show you now, back to the question of where do we go from here, is what new research is happening now and names that you should be aware of. So there's this guy. Anybody ever heard of him? Go to Google and Google him, his TED Talk.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. He's been at our conference twice. He's a dear friend of the conference. He's a hospice physician, and he's doing research on the dreams and deathbed visions of the dying. And he's an absolutely mainstream dude who noticed that as people were dying, they were seeing their grandmother and Jesus, and you probably heard that a lot of dying people, when they're laying in their bed, their arms go up. Do you know about that? Yep. Because they're reaching for someone who's reaching down for them. It's very, very common. And of course, the medical establishment just gives them more drugs and dismisses. When my father, my stepfather, had really advanced Alzheimer's, he said once to my mother, "There are leaves falling from the ceiling, and each one has a face on them." And she told me that, and I'm like, wow, it's his guides and his ancestors. You know, they're coming. I was so excited. She called the doctor and said, "He's hallucinating," you know, and they tried to shut it down. And so what this guy is doing is trying to wake that up. So check out his TED Talk, if you can. These guys, you probably know who they are. So these are their two big pieces of research, children's past lives and, of course, near-death experience. They're at the University of West Virginia. Yeah.
Are they at West
It's
Virginia?
Virginia.
It's Virginia.
Oh, it is Virginia.
Big difference.
Oh, my gosh. You're right. Can I edit this right here? No, oops, I can't. Okay, let's back up. Okay, yes, you're right. Sorry about that. Okay, so, you know, Google them, read their stuff. It's great. Okay, these are the guys we were talking about earlier. They're working on psychedelic therapy to relieve death anxiety. And Brian's going to be speaking at our conference this year. So they're giving psilocybin to cancer patients and letting them have an experience of being out of body in this beautiful, peaceful place, and they're not afraid to die anymore. You probably know this guy, Stuart Hameroff. Anybody know him? So he's at the university. Now this guy is a trip. He was at our conference once. He is so brilliant and so scientific, you can't understand one word that he says. And he's an anesthesiologist. So his thing is like, where do people go when they're under anesthesia? What a perfect guy to study that. And he calls it quantum mechanical general relativity approaches to consciousness, molecular mechanical, and he has developed, like, in anesthesia, and I don't have enough medical knowledge to explain this, but there's like charts of levels of unconsciousness that you go to. So he has a chart that goes like 50 levels below that, where that he's trying to identify where your consciousness goes.
So is he graphically representing this as a descent or an ascent?
That's a really good question. And I've seen his chart, but it was a long time ago and I can't remember. But I think it was probably a descent because
He's working with medical.
Because, well, and you're starting with normal, right? And you are going down, in, if you're an anesthesiologist, you are going into what he would call unconscious. But when you go down that track far enough, you're actually becoming more and more conscious, right? And something that you learn in hospice work with dying people is when the person's in the bed and they're actively dying, and you walk in there and they look like they're unconscious, they're more conscious than they've ever been. And what people don't understand, and the nurses understand this, and we try to tell people this, like when your loved one is in hospice and there's a stage of dying where you can visit and you can say, I love you, and it's okay to go, and all that stuff, but you get to a certain stage where you want to leave them alone because they are out there, outside of their body, and they're having a very, very busy and important experience out there, and you don't want to walk in and shake them and go, hi, Dad, Uncle Bill is here. You want to say hi? Come on, Uncle Bill. You just don't do that. That's like being pulled back in from a near-death experience, right? So that's the kind of, so, you know, they're in highest consciousness when that's happening. And that's, I think, the kind of stuff that Stuart Hameroff is.
Put out a do not disturb sign.
Well, they do. But, you know, my son's hospice nurse, who I'm still really good friends with, who's a supporter of the conference now, she actually gives us donations because she loves the conference so much. She said that when someone's dying and you have all the people visiting, it's like being a guest of honor at the party and you don't want to be the first to leave. And the dying person will stay there and will keep coming back into their body and keep waking up because that's what you've done all your life. When people come to visit, you have to talk to them and be a host. And so it's like the worst thing that you can do. But, you know, again, how do we educate the public to learn this, to learn to be respectful of dying? You know, we're taught how to behave as children, how to be quiet in a library and how to say please and thank you. Nobody teaches us anything about how to be around death, especially in this culture where death is medicalized and sanitized. I mean, you know, I never saw a dead person until my grandmother died, and the second dead person I ever saw was my son. And that was as age like 39 and then 54. And that was my entire experience to a dead body. That's how it is for most people in America.
Terri, how do you live in this world knowing so much about that side? How do you just go shopping and stuff? Doesn't that like bullshit?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, you know, so you can't, it's hard to contain. For me personally, that's why I went to school and got all this education to become a teacher, so that I don't have to contain it. I can give it to you. And you write books and you share it, I think, you know, but maybe not everybody can write a book or be a teacher. So your question is really, how do you contain it? And if you don't have tools for containing it, you will have panic attacks. So we have to learn healing tools, and this is a great question. So this is why we need meditation, ritual and ceremony, stuff to process that energy, because if you're just letting that energy just sit there in you, you will get sick or you will get psychotic. And so one of the things that we all have to learn and teach is tools for managing that energy. For me personally, my big thing is ceremony, you know, which is, every culture knows this. This is why what do we have? We have a funeral. It's a real nothing of a ceremony for most people. But real meaningful ceremony, like if you're having angst, if you're having really intense grief or panic attack, it's what the shamans do. You take a stone, you go, blow really hard into it, several times. Now all your energy's in the stone. While you are in the process of blowing into that stone, you can't be blowing into that stone and being in angst at the same time. They can't exist in the same space. Now the stone is carrying it for you. Big, heavy thing. Stone's been here for a billion years. Take it outside, bury it in the earth. Give it to Mother Earth, let her hold it for you. Just the symbolic act of transferring the energy to something bigger than you to hold it for you is enough to relieve some of that discomfort. So the next time you go to the grocery store and you feel like an alien, you do body work. Just simple breathing into your abdomen and grounding.
Once you open this Pandora's box, there's no going back to the Muggle world.
No, there is not.
It's impossible.
We're stuck here now.
You're like stuffing a butterfly back in the cocoon. Try it.
Yeah, you're right. I love that you use Muggle. I haven't used that word in years. It's great. Yeah.
This is a very good question. Thank you. And it's something I deal with as well. And I find that as long as a part of me can stay present just with my professional responsibilities, just doing day-to-day stuff, that just trying to do that as well as can be done is really, for me anyway, it really works to keep me balanced. I know it's not the whole thing, God knows, but it's part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And this is, I didn't want to get into this, but I'm working on a book right now, and one of the things, it's called, What's This About an Afterlife? That's the title. And one of the first chapters, I'm trying to define reality. And without going into the stages of it, I'm saying basically that there's no definitive definition, but there's a good working definition that works for me. And his reality is anything that has consequences. Anything that can give rise to anything. And at the bottom of that is that everything is real. That illusions are real if they have consequences. We deal with them all the time. We deal at every level of reality. There's also a level of illusion. And this is something that's for me. If I include the Muggle universe, if you want to put it that way, in the package of reality, that helps me to be less split or less dual about it. It's like there's a part of me that's no longer judging it.
Right, because they're in the kaleidoscope too.
Exactly, yeah. So it's one thing to be able to see and appreciate the various levels, if you want to put it that way, but to remove the value judgment
Right.
from it. It's something that works for me, and it helps me, focus on my everyday life.
Yeah, and to realize that everybody is where they are on their path. And who are we to judge somebody else's path? And boy, that's really, try going to a Jesuit university and a Presbyterian seminary to work on that judgment stuff. It's really, really hard. I was going to say that I heard a definition of reality recently that I really liked, and I wish I could remember the whole thing, but it was something like, reality is just what everybody agrees on.
That's one.
Yeah.
That's an easy definition. We can say it's consensus, and it's consensus all the way down or all the way up, if you want to look at it that way.
But it's not.
Consensus realities in the.
But it's so subjective, because if the people in the church next door do not have the same reality that the people in this room have.
And do the people in this room, we can both agree there's a computer over there. I have no idea how you perceive it. What, even technically, physically, I have no idea how you see it, nor do I have any idea of the associations and the meaning.
Well, and we're all of like mind, we assume, in this room. We have something that is bonding us, but each one of us sees it a little bit differently. And there are no absolute rules. There are no ions doctrines. I don't think there are there? Except maybe there are other worlds besides the physical. That would be it. And we all agree on that. Yeah.
Well, now there's 3 or 4 different things I was going to say. One of the things that concerns me is that a lot of times other people's perception of reality puts in peril the planet. Puts in peril the sanity of the person who's being diagnosed as crazy when they're actually seeing their grandmother. And I was attracted to coming here partly by the kind of activist tone of it, like, what are we going to do about this? And I'm wondering, there's kind of 2 different philosophies, and it's actually, I think, a continuum, a spectrum, and it's walking a fine line, but I was always raised to believe, since nobody's going to hell, it doesn't matter what they believe. I was raised in a spiritualist family, but now I'm beginning to realize that it actually does matter to life here on Earth. Not that everybody believes like me, but that we're not just going along with throwing out evidence, that we're actually all searching for the truth instead of calling people crazy or calling people of the devil.
Well, the good news is that calling people of the devil, that whole thing is disappearing from America.
Really?
Yes. I was actually going to bring a whole shitload of statistics about this, but I didn't. The trend now, if you look at the Pew, P-E-W research studies on religion, the religious landscape of America, the millennials are the least religious generation that's ever been studied. Church attendance is down everywhere. So we are making a difference. I think because of the multicultural exposure that we have because of the internet. We're seeing other ways of thinking that we did not have access to 30, 40 years ago.
But then the other part of the equation is, part of the difference is this materialist science. There's an awful lot of people, atheism has always been a very small percentage of the population, but it is growing, I think, among millennials, as opposed to open-minded spirituality or...
Actually, that's not true. Atheism is growing, but now we have SBNR, spiritual but not religious. That is now a thing.
However, I remember going to something called the Spiritual Progressives, and I started letting down my hair and saying, what I believed in, and they all looked at me like I was crazy. And it turns out they were all scientific materialists, and calling themselves spiritual, and what it means really is ethics and the awe and wonder of a random universe that...
Right, that sounds like humanists. The humanists are like that.
They call it spiritual because...
Right. There's something called spiritual humanism, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And it's just what you said. Yeah.
I have a question. You had, I agree, I love the activism you started.
Yeah, we're going to get there.
And I was wondering, I mean, actually, no, you did, when you talked about how somebody could be diagnosed as, say, borderline, schizophrenic, and you were saying that you had made something like did you say that, or did I misunderstand that you had actually compiled something to separate this confusion that doctors and...
No, I didn't compile. What I did is the little charts that you were looking at.
Okay.
I don't have the skill to separate that confusion.
I'm really interested in that. I think you're so right, you know, that people have these amazing experiences and so we are living in a very tangible, three-dimensional world, and we could talk the talk, but you know, we do need some level ground to talk to each other. And I'm just wondering, that's just such a beautiful question. I know that, and I do think things are changing. I think Elizabeth Kubler, you know, just hospice itself is changing. It wouldn't exist if there wasn't change of our beliefs about dying and allowing that to happen. So,
yeah, so it's happening.
But yeah, I'd be really interested in anybody in this room or anything that you know of, to sort of educate the medical profession to understanding and I know the after effects of an NDE, it's actually being compiled. The differences, for instance, people remember it. They never forget. 40 years later, they tend to have better lives. They don't get depressed. So there's a very definite list that doctors are open to, or medical professionals, I should say.
Some of them.
Some of them. But it's quite benign.
Well, that's what IONS is doing. You know, IONS is the keeper of that information. And thank goodness for that, you know. Yay, IONS for that. I mean,
yeah, all these movements, but it would be interesting to see something.
Well, one of the things that I want to talk about too, let me just skip over this. Okay, Pim Van Lommel, you probably know who he is. Here's some other guys who did some pretty cool stuff. Robert Monroe. I just threw them all in here just because I wanted to have a compilation of them. Kenneth Ring, he did, you know, he's the guy who did the study that showed that blind people can see in their NDEs. That's the most amazing thing in the whole world. So I wanted to get to this guy, Sam Parnia. So this is the guy you want to know. Go Google NPR interview with Sam Parnia, Erasing Death is the name of the book. It's the best interview you'll ever hear about NDEs. Absolutely amazing. So this guy's a New York University professor, School of Medicine. He is, to me, he's the new Raymond Moody. His research, I get so excited when I talk about this. This is a perfect thing. Okay, so his big research is called the AWARE Project, meaning awareness during resuscitation. He was in this big hospital, and see these little ceiling tiles right here? Okay, so all the hospital ceilings were like this. And in his study, he would take not one of the tiles from the ceiling, but he'd go into the storage room or whatever and get a tile. And this was his study. He did this hundreds, and he got all these tiles, and he put a picture on them, like a picture of a cow. And he would suspend them on little wires from the ceiling, from the other tiles. So if this was the ICU, you'd have like 20 of these little tiles hanging below the ceiling. And each one would have a picture. Do you guys know about this study? Each one would have a picture on it.
Facing up.
Facing up. So the only way you could see it is if you were up there. That was how he did his study. And he had them for like a year and a half in the ICU, in the emergency room, and wherever people died. And people would report when they were dead, I saw a cow. And sure enough, he was in the room where the cow picture was. That is how he started his work.
That's great. So easy.
It's so easy. It's just, and he proved a lot of stuff. And what he came up with, two things. He's now coined the term resuscitation medicine. So instead of us calling it near-death studies, near-death awareness, which sounds real woo-woo and scares people away, It's called resuscitation medicine now. We have a medical term for it.
You rebranded it.
He rebranded it, but he made it a brand that the mainstream people can hear. And, you know, not that we want to give up the term near-death experience because it means a lot to us, but hey, I'll go with this. And what do? Oh, I'm in the field of resuscitation medicine. Well, what is that? Oh, well, that means when people fly, oh yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that? And so now we're getting into the conversation in the mainstream. The other thing he did is he said, we're not going to call it near-death experience anymore. We're going to call it after-death experience because you're actually dead. Such a simple thing. Again, rebranding. So that's where the new language is going, and that's how we're getting into the mainstream, is with guys like this. I have invited this guy to speak at the Afterlife conference every single year, but he doesn't respond, which makes me really sad. But that's because I'm not sure. Okay, these are his 2 books.
You should come.
Yeah, I never can figure. I know other people who've also tried to reach him. He's behind a big firewall of some kind. You know, either that or he doesn't like the Afterlife conference. You know. So we've looked at all these pictures of these people. What do you notice about all the faces that we've just looked at?
White men.
White men. Now, I'm not saying there aren't women in this field. There are. You know, we have Pam Reynolds and Mary Neal. There's lots of women out there talking about this, but they're not doing research at this level. And so let's talk activism now. This is what we need. And this is where I'm going to start getting into this whole diversity thing of where we need to go next. They're white and they're men. Even the women that we have in this field are white and old.
Or dead.
Or dead. And one of the things that's really bothered me about the Afterlife conference, which we're now in our 9th year, is it's almost all white people. And the speakers, you know, I comb through this research, I look for these leaders in the field, all white, all white. And this year, finally, thanks to a mentor of mine who is black, who's been teaching me about how to make diversity happen, he's taught me things like he wants me to go and do one of my grief workshops at Hunters Point, where he has a lot of church people there, and it's a really bad black neighborhood in San Francisco. And he said, but you can't go there yourself. Not because it's dangerous, but the people won't talk to you. So I have to go with you. He's black. You need a trust agent. And I'm like, oh, what a cool term. So you're going to be my trust agent, and you're going to go to Hunters Point with me, and if you're there, the people will listen to me? And he said, yes. Because in the black church, and it's actually called the Black Church, which is all the different denominations, they are extremely into spiritism. They channel, they talk to spirits, they talk to ancestors, they do seances. The after-death communication is like no big deal to them. It's like grandma did it, it's just part of their life. Why aren't they in this room? Why aren't they at the Afterlife conference? What is this big gap we have between us and it's race? And so that's a really big issue that I would like to see us all work on. I can't tell you exactly how to do it. I know how I can do it in little small ways. So at this year's Afterlife conference, thanks to my friend Floyd, I actually have 3 black presenters, which I have never had before. And it's made me come face to face with my own sense of separation, and you could call it racism. Not that I feel like I'm a racist, but I don't have a lot of people of color in my life because I live in a white neighborhood and I go to, well, my school is very diverse. Anyway, so that's just a really huge thing. And I don't know how to tell us what to do about that. I just know how I've been able. There's a woman named Alua Arthur who's a death doula in Los Angeles. She's black. She does beautiful work. Sonia Lott is at the conference, and I'm bringing my mentor Floyd. So that's a really important thing.
Where's your conference?
This year, thank you for asking, it's going to be in Salt Lake City. We move it to a different city every year. And here are flyers. We may as well just stop for a commercial interruption. I don't have a lot of these, but if you think you might really actually come to Salt Lake City to the conference, do take one. And this is a $75 off coupon.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
When?
Maybe there's other
June
people besides
6th
me that
through
don't know
9th
how many
of
people
June.
come to the.
How many? The biggest year we had was 420, and the lowest was 170. So could be, and this is my email list. We're just stopping and doing commercialism now. Fill this out if you want to know about the conference and be on my email list and hear about my workshops and events and the conference, of course. So.
I haven't written on the
Okay.
list.
Okay. So did I skip? All right. I think I'll pass these around too. Since we're taking a commercial break. Also, I live in Sebastopol, which is north of here, and my friend Linda Backman, who's a past life regression therapist, who's really cool, is coming to town, and we're doing a workshop together in April in Sebastopol, which is about 50 miles north of here. So here's a flyer about that. You want to pass it?
Your website, right?
Yeah, everything's on my website. You know, go on the email, sign the email list, and you'll get everything. That's the best way. But if you're interested in doing this workshop, it's called Bereavement and Past Life Trauma. So if you're dealing with a big grief of some sort, what we're going to do, what Linda's going to do, a group regression and see like where in your past lives you have triggers for the grief that you're having now.
What if you want someone to pass? Will that give you tips to help them get there?
Okay, so while we're doing that, all right, so I put this little thing here, some ideas about how to be more proactive. And I just did this thing on diversity. The other thing too, not just the Black church, but any Latinos in this room? Latinos are so mystical. Oh my God, the Day of the Dead? Hello? That's just the most cross-dimensional thing ever. They completely believe in this stuff. So we're not really looking at a world that we have to sell this idea to. We just have to figure out how to merge our two worlds. And I think that once we start doing that, and the more diverse that it gets, the more it will seep into the medical community. Now, speaking of the medical community, people of color do not like the white medical establishment. They're the last people who are going to tell the doctor that they had an NDE because they don't trust that, Okay. Anyway, let's see what else is on this list here. Any hospice volunteers here? Oh, good. Just two?
Just two?
Just two?
No.
Three?
I've been an elder caregiver.
Okay.
Last 3 years of life for most of my clients.
Okay. And so have you witnessed some deaths?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I would urge you to do that's pretty easy to do is to become a hospice volunteer. You want to get up close and personal to people leaving their bodies. This is how you do it. You got to do something. You got to get out of your house and go do something. And that is by far the easiest thing to do. You have to go through a little bit of training. It's not much. You can work in an inpatient hospice. You can do home visits and start being with people who are dying. Now, that doesn't mean that you can preach to them. You can't sit there and say, I had a near-death experience. Let me tell you about it. And maybe you can have one too. They do train you how to have these conversations. And so what you do is you never talk to a hospice patient about anything spiritual unless they ask. And so they may ask, and they may say, and what do you think happens when we die? Then you can tell them, well, I think, in my own personal opinion, blah, blah, blah. But the way that you can really help is by just gaining the experience. So imagine how it would be a year from now if you just spent the next year being a hospice volunteer, how different your knowledge would be from what it is right now.
Is there legitimately a phenomenon where people, right before they're about to die, that like the day before they get, all of a sudden, it's like, joke's on you, I'm about to get better, and the next day, all of a sudden, their entire body breaks down?
Yes, happens all the time. It's not that they think they're going to get better, they just perk up. Yeah.
My grandmother.
It's their visitors.
She's
Come out of coma.
A question about, you're talking about hallucinating, discerning hallucinating versus higher consciousness. I mean, are some people hallucinating? Would that be is there a division there?
Well, drugs make you hallucinate.
Okay.
So if we remove the drugs from the picture, I would say nobody's hallucinating. They're all having interdimensional experiences. Now, if you give them Ambien, or something, they're going to act, because hallucinating comes from the brain, right? So the brain does all kinds of weird things. But when the brain is off, you can't be hallucinating. It can only be your soul that's having the experience.
True. So if you're dead, your brain's off.
Yeah.
And there's also
Yep.
the perception of
Where do
what
dreams fit into
hallucination
your
means.
picture?
My grandmother, we were all sure that
Well, the Buddhists say,
There's another discussion here.
the Buddhists say that when you dream, your soul flies out of your body and it's attached by a silver cord.
Yep.
And then when you die, the cord is cut, just like an umbilical cord. That makes perfect sense to me.
To what extent do you believe that being more aware of our dreams and the experience in real time, whether it's technically a lucid dream or not, can help us understand out-of-body states?
100%.
I'm very fascinated with.
Dream work is amazing, and I will tell you what I've done. I started keeping a dream journal in 1997, and it was, I'd wake up and I kept a little tape recorder by my bed, and I have amazing dreams. Sometimes I will take a 2-hour nap during the day just so I can dream, because I love my dreams so much. And so because I was always a really good dreamer, I'd keep this tape recorder by the bed. I'd wake up, I'd tell the dream into the tape recorder, then in the morning I'd get up and type it into a Microsoft Word document. That document is now 100 pages single-spaced, that I've been adding dreams since 1997. If you can, if for any reason do this, start recording your dreams. It's the most powerful thing. And you can eventually start to have lucid dreams where you really are aware that you're dreaming. But even if you don't, the dreams are going to give you so many incredible messages about what's going on in your life.
Are you familiar with J.W. Dunn's book, An Experiment with Time? This is something that I did several times, this experiment. Dunn was an early British aircraft designer back in the 1920s. And he had some theories of consciousness that he worked on. And one of the directions he took this in was to try to understand the nature of time and the perception of time. And the experiment is very simple. You do exactly what you've been describing. The moment you wake up, note it or record it in as much detail as possible. Before anything else comes into your mind, focus on the dream, note it. Do this for 2 weeks. Then after the 2 weeks, review the material and see how many of these impressions were precognitive. And I did that experiment some years ago, and I had some really outstanding, not only precognitive experiences, but during this period of focusing on the dreams, I had dreams that brought up memories that I had erased from my conscious mind 10 minutes after they happened. I lived in Paris for a while. One day I'm walking along the river, and they had just dragged a body up out of the river. It was lying on the side, and I had to walk past it going where I was going. First dead body I'd ever seen. It was ugly. It was full of mud and bloated and all that. Very, very unpleasant. Within 10 minutes, I had erased that impression from my conscious mind completely. I never thought about it, never remembered it. Until several years later, I did this experiment, and in a dream, I saw, in the dream, there were 2 guys in a rowboat pulling a body up out of a river, and I woke up and I said, "Oh my God!"
Yeah. So when
How
you
many other things have I erased from my?
and when you repress something, where does it go? It goes somewhere. It goes into your body, but it also hovers around in that bank of stuff. And to bring it back, like that's really good stuff. Dreams are absolutely amazing. I mean, Edgar Cayce did readings while he slept. And the shamans go into dream world all the time. It's really, so please absolutely write down your dreams. Okay, what else? Anything on this list catch anybody's attention?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about number 6. What did you mean by a unit of CPE?
Oh, CPE. If you have a degree, like a bachelor's degree in psychology or social work, or different programs have different qualifications, you can do a unit of chaplaincy training. It's called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. So you can Google it and find a hospital near you And you have to have a little bit of a spiritual reason. So I'm just going to make this, let's say you have a bachelor's degree in psychology from many years ago. You can apply to one of these programs, and it's basically a chaplaincy internship, and you spend 4 months working in a hospital and getting trained. It's really, really good experience. And you have to like write an essay on your spiritual path. And the problem with CPE is it tends to be very Christian slanted because it's an old traditional institution. But I did it, and there are Buddhist chaplains and Muslim chaplains and pagan chaplains, and you don't have to become a chaplain, but you could if you wanted to, and that's how you start.
Through established academic schools, or what? Who sponsors them?
They're sponsored by the Association of Professional Chaplains, and they have programs in hospitals. So you could go, like Marin General has it. I have friends who are chaplains there. So call up Marin General and tell them that you're interested in, their chaplaincy program, and they'll send you some information and see if that's something that you might like to do. And they're very liberal there. My chaplain friend there is an African man from Kenya who's a Quaker.
Of course.
Do you know that Kenya has the largest population of Quakers in the world?
No.
I didn't know that either until he told me that. And
Is that a good thing?
it's not a good thing or a bad thing, and it's not from missionary work. No, it's because I don't know much about Quakers, but like the founders, or two guys who really popularized Quakers, moved to Africa and to Kenya and built a community, and tons of them came over there, and a lot of Africans joined. This is a terrible way to describe it, but I really don't know how to describe it. And my friend Stanley, his family, he comes from a little village in Kenya. On his mother's side are all Quakers, and his father's side are all shamans.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting combination.
CPE also means, as you know, continuing professional education. And so,
This is completely different.
Yeah. It's a little
this is clinical pastoral education. And pastoral is I am my doctorate is in pastoral care and counseling, which means that it's like counseling, but with a pastoral edge, which is just another word for spiritual. So I'm not a therapist, I'm a spiritual counselor. And so it's and that's another thing I want to say. So you guys probably know, as well as I do, how there's a shaman on every street corner. There's a medium on every street corner. Everybody's a healer. Everybody's a grief counselor. Everybody's a spiritual teacher. It's the cool thing to do now, is to be a spiritual teacher or a shaman. I get proposals from people every single day of my life wanting to teach at the Afterlife conference. I'm a shaman. Oh, where did you train in shamanism? Oh, I didn't. I've just read a lot of books, and I've I did ayahuasca. It's like, no, you're not a shaman. Even my shaman teachers do not call themselves shamans because they're not initiated. You have to be initiated into tribes. So there's a lot of phonies out there. So one of the, and they're out, and you probably know some of them, they're not hard to find. So what my big peeve is, get some real credentials. It's not that hard. If you want to be a spiritual teacher, you can go, this isn't my number one recommendation, but you could. There are grief counseling trainings that you can do on a few weekends. There's the Four Winds School in Utah. You can go and get shamanism training. You can do like a whole year program or a month program. Go out and learn some stuff. And this is okay. Now I'm going to. This is one of my complaints about a lot of our leaders, and I'm going to tell you who I have this complaint about is Eben Alexander, and also Anita Morjani. Both of them have been at my conference. I have a bias against people who go straight from the operating table to the podium, because my thing is, go spend a year in a monastery, go study with some shamans, go get a theology degree. Don't just become a best-selling author and stand there like you know everything just because you had an NDE and you were out of your body for 5 minutes. Sorry. that does not qualify for you to be a speaker at the Afterlife
Well,
conference.
He had the credibility to come out as a doctor.
Well, here's the thing that he did. He did do that.
He was all over the place.
He was all over the place, but he preached to the choir. And he had the credentials. He could have taught at Harvard. He could have gone and talked to doctors and nurses, and he didn't.
Yeah, he was let go from Harvard, so I don't think he could have.
Eben was let go from Harvard?
So Esquire did an expose.
Yeah,
of
that
him.
was a little damaging.
It was very damaging.
That wasn't Harvard, though. That was where he was before. I don't think it was Harvard.
Problems at Harvard.
What was
But
the
I'm just-
expose about?
Eben Alexander.
I didn't know. I do remember the thing in Esquire, but I can't remember what it was exactly.
Some credentialing issues, I guess. But, I
Yeah.
can't verify that. I was.
Well, so my gripe about him is you're a neurosurgeon. You had this really important experience. You should be talking to medical students, not to a bunch of woo-woo people.
I have actually seen him try to talk to scientists. I have seen him on panels. I can't quote which ones they are, and it's very difficult. But I have seen him.
And it is difficult, and they won't accept him. So he talks to scientists. He talks at ions. He talks to ions, which is also scientists. But they're scientists who've come over to the dark side.
No, I've seen him. If you look on YouTube, you can find
TED
it.
Talk and all that.
Yeah.
Then there was John Mack. Do you remember? Does anybody
Oh,
know
yeah,
who he
John
was?
Mack.
He was really
Yes,
brave
yes,
to
yes,
do what he
yes.
did.
What did he do?
He believed people who thought that they were abductees, like alien abductees.
Alien abductees.
So he was a Harvard psychiatrist.
And then
Wasn't too happy with him.
and they weren't happy with him. Yeah. So that's.
He also, shortly before he died, was getting very, very interested in afterlife-related matters.
Oh, really?
Very, very shortly before he died.
So, the medical establishment, I have two young nephews who are newly minted doctors who just finished their residencies, one in pediatrics and ER double residency, and the other one in wilderness medicine, which is really cool. And so they've just recently been in medical school, and they both told me that there was no training in death and dying and no spiritual care. There's a palliative care clinical rotation that you can do, but it's optional, and palliative care is not about death necessarily, misunderstood word. And then my other doctor friends that I know who are older than these two kids say, I had never had we never talked about death.
It's not an option.
It's not an option. And so, that's another reason why it's really important for us to get our foot in that door. If it's as a chaplain, as it's a hospice volunteer, a grief counselor, just anything. So we need to get our foot in that door somehow, or get our information. That's why, I would say to Eben Alexander, just, fight for this. Don't give up. Go fight to go talk to the medical conferences. Just because they knock you down a few times, so what? But now what he's doing, he's preaching to the choir.
Has anyone come up with a model that bridges the materialist and the greater perspective? And this is something I'm searching for in my work.
I think some of these researcher guys have done that.
Is there a translation or a middle ground that can work? And then, again, this is something I'm asking myself and searching for. I think one thing I'm beginning to work with is questioning whether materialist science is equated to science. Materialism is an assumption. It's a belief system. Science is a method of inquiry. And those two have been married so firmly in our minds that it's very hard to pull them apart.
Well, that's
what we're talking about here is we're using our own scientific methodology in a lot of these fields. It's just not materialist science. But it follows, careful observation, categorization, statistics, and so on. I mean, this is all perfectly scientific methodology. It's just that we're broadening our field of evidence.
And I think
rule out the physical, but it puts it in a larger box.
Oh, I think that's changing. Don't you think those parameters are evolving? But it's just slow. It's really, scientific method is scientific method, And if you can't weigh a soul that weighs an ounce when it leaves the body, then we don't count it.
I contend that that's not that there are many things that can be measured that are not physical.
Yes, but
Measured to the extent that they can be rationally evaluated, demonstrated, replicated to a great degree. And when we find out what can be replicated, then we see the stuff over here that's not strictly replicable, but is teaching us something.
well, I think that's what these guys are doing. This is what Parney is doing, and as much as he can. I mean, he's talking about something that can't be measured physically.
Be measured statistically.
Well, I think it has to be measured. Well, statistically, 2% of people don't remember their NDEs because their brain, I mean, that stuff counts in the mainstream. We can't just say there's a beautiful universe out there that we all have access to. It doesn't fly.
There are commonalities.
Yeah, we have all that.
That can be.
Yeah.
I think it's important to keep in mind the history of how science got to be this way. I've read several books that talk about the reaction to the church, to the negative things about the church, both Protestant and Catholic, and the swearing that if we get any kind of spiritual evidence, we got to totally ignore it because that'll lead us right back to the Inquisitions and the burning at the stake and the witch hunts. And if you read some of the quote-unquote atheist literature, a lot of it is saying just that they do have an agenda to not get back into superstition that causes negative things.
That atheist agenda, I was on the board of the American Humanist Association for 10 years. And it was because I really wanted to get behind them politically. I didn't like what they were, I supported what they did with separation of church and state. And you have to agree to it's called the Humanist Manifesto, which I did not agree with, which was exactly what you just said. It's all science, it's all empirical, there's no spiritual world, we don't believe in any of that stuff. And I went along with it because I wanted to, they actually ordain people so that you can perform marriages, humanist marriages and funerals, and I wanted to do that. But I mostly wanted to get behind, they would fight for things like not having an anti-abortion campaign in a a public building like a courtroom or something. So that's why I was there. When I wrote my first book after my son died, I was still on the board with my fingers crossed behind my back. And I believed everything then that I do now, I just didn't tell them. And when my book came out, the president of the organization called me and he goes, "So, I hear you wrote a book about talking to your dead son." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you really believe that?" And I said, "Yeah, of course I do." And he said, "Well, you can't be in our organization if you believe that." And I said, "I know, so I guess I'll resign." And he said, "Well, okay, but before you resign, would you like to come to our conference and debate us about this?" And I said, "No, because I will never debate anybody about this, because this just is real for me, and I'm not going to sit in a room with a bunch of people who argue with me and try to prove it. I don't have to prove this to you. I don't care if you believe it or not." So they kicked me out of the board and they took away my ordination. So I am now a defrocked humanist minister and an excommunicated humanist. And you're right, they're like that. And they're just, I used to, when I lived in Alabama, I used to go to this Unitarian church and they were all humanists like that, believe it or not, in Alabama. And I would sometimes give a talk, and one time I decided to lead a guided meditation. So I had everybody, take a breath, imagine this, blah, blah. And at the end, the boss of the place came up to me and he said, "We don't take kindly to, asking people to close their eyes and bow their heads." And I said, "Well, neither do I. Where did you get that?" And he goes, "Well, that's what you did. You asked people to close their eyes and bow their heads." No way did I say that. I would never say close your eyes and bow your head, but that's what he heard. And that's what he thought I was doing, and that was like too religious for him. So those people, they're like a sect. That's how I see it. And so what do we care about them? There's millions out there like that.
They have a lot of influence in academia. I mean, that's part
they do.
of what
That's
Stephen
true.
Alexander was up against and everything.
Yeah, they do. Yep.
In all your travels and experiences, have you ever come across pure evil in yourself?
Oh, God, this is a conversation that's going to take 10 more hours.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Pure evil. Is there pure evil? I don't believe in evil.
Okay.
That, you know, and that.
Is it a human construct?
I think so. You know,
There's no,
because
there's
it's.
no satanic kind of entity.
I would also not say that the universe is only love, either. I would say that it's neutral. And so, the idea of evil comes from, the good example of this is like the worst thing that can happen to a person, a terrible trauma, your child gets run over by a truck in front of you. I know people this has happened to, terrible trauma. And so they'll say things like, how can God let this terrible thing happen? And this is the question that everybody asks. You know, there was a drought, our tribe has no food, we all starved, the gods are mad at us. We start assigning it to this God idea, and you have to have a rationale for discomfort. So you make up this opposite thing, the devil. But in order to do that, you have to first think that the first thing is good, and therefore the other thing is bad. So there has to be a value judgment on this is good and this is bad.
Create a binary.
Yes, create a binary. And so we make this stuff up. Personally, I don't think there is any good or bad. Really terrible shit happens, but I don't attribute it to some evil forces because I don't have that binary. I don't see the universe as good or bad. And so when I'm talking to religious people, you know, I'll say things like, what if, you know, what's your biggest question about God? Well, you know, how could God let the Holocaust happen? You know, God loved the Jews. How could that happen? Something like that. And I'll just say, what if God is neutral? What if God doesn't have an opinion? And it's just this force of creation. It's just, I don't care what you do. The river doesn't care if it dries up. You know, that's the kind of stuff and it pisses them off. They hate that. But that's what I think. And that's my opinion.
Did your son give you that at all?
No, I've actually always had that. You know, and that's from reading a lot of Buddhist books and stuff when I was young. Evil never made any sense to me. So you look at like the worst person in the world, and it's always Hitler, of course. You know, but there are worse people. I mean, there are just as bad people. And why is that guy like that? You know, the guy who shoots the kids in the school, why did he do that? There's a million reasons, but it's not that he comes from this other force of creation called evil. He comes from the same force that we come from. And I've had people in my groups, bereaved parents, who will ask me, you know, my child was killed, was murdered, and now the murderer is dead. Are they in the same afterlife? And I'll say yes. And they'll say, I can't tolerate the idea that my kid is in the same afterlife as Hitler or the guy who killed him. Of course you can't, because you've got to have that binary. But I think they're in the same afterlife. What do you think?
I think it's a really big universe.
Well, that's the other thing. There's not like one afterlife.
Right.
You know, there's like billions of dimensions, and this is a really cool thing that I like about, you know, having this biblical knowledge. So Jesus said, in my Father's house are many mansions. That is such a cool statement, because that's what he's talking about. I mean, the things that Jesus said, of what we know that he actually said, because most of it we really don't know, made beautiful metaphysical sense. Yep. In my Father's house are many mansions, which means this isn't all there is. You know, this is just one level. There's like an endless, infinite amount of levels of consciousness. And we're just experiencing this little one right here, and we're so attached to it. And this gets me onto another thing about activism, and then I'm going to have to stop. But, and you may not like what I'm going to say, but my feeling about climate change and saving the planet is sort of like that too. Because to me, that's still just this one little level in this third dimensional world. Now, I'm not saying that we should pollute the water and leave our trash everywhere. Of course, we have to be responsible for our piece of the planet and do all the right things to protect Mother Earth and do all of that. But I'm not afraid of the planet dying. That doesn't bother me one bit. And that really upsets people when I say that. And it's like, well, what about our children? It's like, well, you know, they're going to inherit some shit just like we inherited it, and this is a species. We're not anything. You know, we're just a species. They come and go all the time. Planets come and go all the time. Planets are exploding as we speak from who knows what reason. Why is this one so special, other than the fact that we're here? Is there another reason besides we're here? Just something to think about.
There's also the argument that this planet would be better off without human beings.
Yes.
Well, George Carlin calls humanity a surface infection. So yes. And if we were gone, the planet would go right back to its beautiful, pristine self.
It's funny, you know, because I'm from Hawaii and there's just a recent volcanic activity, right? And there's beautiful pot ponds and stuff, and Mount Pele just took it all.
Yeah.
And after just a couple of months, stuff's growing on it.
Yeah.
And in Hawaii, if they don't constantly keep the roads trimmed, in weeks they grow over. I mean, it's amazing the regenerative powers of Mother Nature.
Well, and Pele is the god of destruction. It's like Kali in Hinduism. You know, you have to have that destruction because you don't just get to stay in pristine happy land all the time. There has to be birth and rebirth.
If you have a vacation house, you're disappointed.
Say that again?
If you have a vacation house there on the beach,
Yeah.
then you're disappointed.
Yeah, we're all disappointed, you know, we're disappointed that our bodies get old and sick and die, and, you know, and that's what Buddhism was all about. You know, the story of Buddha was they didn't let him see any illness or death or aging. He was completely protected from that. He never went outside the palace walls. And then one day he accidentally, his caretaker accidentally let him see a dead guy. And he said, wow, there's something outside these walls that's really important. And now we have Buddhism. Okay, I'm tired of talking. Thank you, guys. Yeah.